one thing that really comes to mind is the closing of local elementary schools and communities. And again, going back to what you said about that sense of memory and connection to a location, with some of our elementary schools, middle schools being closed down due to financial strains and other motivating factors, it goes into this weird sense of de-enfranchisement that's going on within our own communities and those decisions that have to be made. Because when these schools are closed, kids who are out of district don't have any other options, right?
Right.
And when it comes to us being able to provide our own forms of education, like when we made applications for our own form of native-based schools in an appeal for the Board of Education for North Carolina, and that was turned away,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because apparently it was discriminatory
Oh my
to
God.
I was
Woo!
like
That was
there's
crazy.
like there's this complete cognitive dissonance and disconnection um, with also conveying these needs to non-Indian settlers who are in these positions of power, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not understanding those dynamic histories. It all comes back to education, right? The necessity of education, the push and pull of education, and what that's done for our people and done to our people at
Right.
the same time.
Right, absolutely. And you mentioned the elementary schools closing. A lot of that is because of flooding. After Hurricane
Mm,
Matthew and Hurricane Florence, people are depopulating some of the communities, districts where schools had been, thriving for a while.
mm,
And that depopulation meant a population increase in some other districts, but also people just had to like go. They were
right.
not trying to move to another district in Robeson County. It wasn't like white flight or something. It
Yeah.
was like people had to actually relocate to other cities and other places to find work,
Mm,
and to do what they could do. And so the hurricane flooding um has I mean, yeah, it's like if it's not one thing, it's another. So the hurricane flooding, or three things, the hurricane flooding just really kind of piled on that sense of that economic edge, that people were already living on. And education has, and the need for it has intensified, and the availability of it has, or the unavailability of it has also intensified.
mm,
Not to mention the kind of cultural, the it's not a luxury, but we're told it's a luxury to be able to educate your children in a culturally responsive way. And that's what that academy, the old mainstream academy that the Board of Education rejected, was trying to do. It was just trying to educate kids, mostly Indian kids because that's who lives there, right? But it was not closed off to anybody else, but it was mostly Indian kids because that's who lives there, trying to educate them in a culturally responsive and responsible way. And the
mm.
Board of Education said, no. They said that's discriminatory. And you're like, blink, blink,
Yeah, that's the exact reaction.
yeah,
Just blink,
blink.
blink.
What did you just say? You know, it was they called it Marxist. Actually, I don't know if you were following that whole piece of the thing, but they were using the school. I mean, it was really and it still
uh,
is such a good idea. I mean, I hope it still happens. I think it will.
fingers
Yeah,
crossed.
fingers crossed. But Sandy Grandy's Red Pedagogy was
Mm,
the foundational curriculum of the school. And so that's, of course, is brilliant. It's applied
mm,
everywhere. It's talked about all over the place. It should be used everywhere if it's not already. But the framework that she has created is something that can be used anywhere for a native or non-native community. It's about being culturally responsive to places and using our
mm,
places, our sacred places, our other places as tools to guide the curriculum, right?
mm.
So this just seems like the most neutral, like kid friendly thing ever. Like, but they called it Marxist because nobody, I think, bothered to read the text. Um, and they
Probable.
also said that it was discriminatory because, frankly, it's just not discriminating in the right direction.
Mm,
You know,
right.
And that's just deeply like, what? So, yes, we have schools closing down. We have this other group of really committed people who want to open a new school, and then they're told no, you know? And so it's back to that kind of extractive economy that is settler colonialism. It's not, well, settler colonialism is, it can include extractive elements. It doesn't, I suppose, all the time.
Mm,
Um, there are other forms of colonialism that are explicitly extractive. And then I think what we do, what we live through in Lumbee land is a, a form of colonialism that is um, driven by settler imperatives. And because we have been able to stay on our own land, owning our own land in many respects, rather than, for example, on reserve territory or trust land,
mm.
we have a different kind of relationship. Like settlers have kind of amped up what they couldn't gain. They've said, "Well, you're not going to give us your land, but we're going to extract everything we can, culturally,
Mm,
socially, educationally, resource-wise, from your land." And so it's like it's not it's similar, obviously, to the forms of settler colonialism that have unfolded elsewhere in the United States, but it's like simultaneously erasing and extracting at the same time. And of course
mm,
this is true elsewhere, but it's the education story is, it's pretty apparent, I think, how we're being, or they're bleeding us. So
right. And I think one other interesting element that comes to mind, just with my own experience with going through the public schools of Robeson County, is even with the Indian education component that's supposed to be added in to not necessarily the curriculum itself, but rather the student's experience going through the school system, is that pretty much what ends up happening with the Indian ed agents who are placed in the schools is they get subverted, or rather, I would like to say downsized because that's what it feels like for them, from my perspective, as guidance counselors.
mm,
Folks who are supposed to be in these positions to provide enriched, native based educational values, traditions, histories, and knowledge bases are really limited by what the system within the state structure allows them to do, and even at the county level. So it's mind-boggling even here in such a predominantly American Indian community, that they're just kind of downsized to these small elements.
right.
So, in a lot of regards, I know even growing up here and going through the school system, I never really learned anything about American Indians, other than when we have American Indian Heritage Month, we would have some dancers come out and some drummers. But unless you were in the culture, you never really learned about the culture. So for me, it would have done wonders for me to be able to connect with my own culture on a deeper level and a more educational aspect, um, because being able to educate others about your culture, the shared culture that you have together, is empowering, right?
Right.
That does wonders. Like I can only imagine if a lot of the stuff I learned in college was learned in high school or even before that in middle school, elementary school. That would have put me on a completely different trajectory, with being able to get into this work for community quicker and to be able to come into it with more, a larger breadth of information, knowledge bases, that are needed to do this work.
Right. Well, it's so important, and I heard a graduate student give a research presentation last week about research she was doing on American Indian students' transition to college at UNC Pembroke.
Mm,
And she was finding that, they were having a difficulty transitioning to a school that was fundamentally theirs, right? So our ancestors,
right.
their ancestors created this place. They founded it, they funded it, they did everything to build it. It's their school, and here in 2020 or the 21st century, we have Indian kids that are struggling to adjust to their own school.
Mm,
And she was describing that struggle as one, as you sort of put it, of like cultural awareness, right? So
Mm,
there are ways in which kids are taught in the public schools that their Indian culture is not Indian, right? We only get to talk about it once a month. Or anyway, within this
mm.
1 month of the year, right? It's like set aside thing. And if what you live on a daily basis doesn't look like what we talk about during this month, then you may not be Indian. Or all the
Right.
things that you've been told about being Indian like aren't valid according to the kind of public school version, low resourced level of information that we're able to provide you about
Mm,
being Native. And so when kids do get to college, this graduate student was finding, they feel this sense of loss and a kind of a sense of anger, right? That they didn't know before, or they didn't know more than they know.
mm,
And I wonder if we can help address that by like renaming what we do in our homes, in our households, our who's your people conversations. You know, the ways that we go visit our ancestors when we're putting up corn, when we're learning our sustainability, when we're,
mm,
doing these things that have been enduring for thousands of years. Why can't we call that culture? And we need to
mm.
name it that way, so that students,
Right.
as soon as they enter into dialogue with people who are not their family, they can understand, this is my culture, this is my family's expectations of me and my behavior. This is how they expect me to treat others, like that's part of our culture. um, this is how they expect me to speak, you know, and so that's my culture. So I'm going to carry that through. I'm going to like add on to that scaffold, with like text and images and art and
Mm.
music and um, dance and ritual and, all the
Right.
things that sometimes help us feel, as you said, like empowered because we can teach it to somebody else. But the scaffold is with us all the time,
Mm,
and I feel like it's hard to become a college student and just be learning that you have this scaffold when you've been told kind of your a whole other, formal schooling, like you don't have any scaffold, or you're not, there's nothing about your culture or community that's resonant with being indigenous. They have to figure
mm,
that out when they get to college. It's like, as you said, I mean, it can derail you. You've been able to channel it into some things that are predominantly, I mean, that are really productive for not just yourself but others. And I just want everybody to be able to do that. So when I'm teaching indigenous students in college, I'm like, you already have everything you need, you know. Maybe
mm,
name it for yourself and then use that. And then yeah, here's all the other stuff that you can build onto that scaffold. But I just feel like, native students they have everything they need, but it's hard to look at the way people are treated in public schools, not just kind of in Indian communities, but everywhere.
mm,
Native students in any public school system having to say, nope, I'm not visible here. And what I
mm.
do see when I do see something that they call Indian, it's, it's a kid in a feather in a construction paper headdress,
Right.
you know, or it's a
Oh,
mascot.
along with the handprint
The
turkey to
handprint
go with it.
turkey, it's like the mascot in my high school team. It's
Mm,
all this stuff that is just not real.
mhm.
So, anyway, no wonder we get grown up and we're like, "Oh crap. This is not what I thought it was." It's just
Right.
yeah.
The relearning process of a lot of the things that you thought you understood when you were younger is not just horrendous, but sometimes it's one of those eye blinking moments where you're like, "Wow,
Yeah,
I thought this was reality for so long."
right.
But the reality is so far from the truth, rather so far from what's here in the present.
Mhm. Well, I really
And I
saw
think
that with racism. Like, so when the Confederate
mm,
monument stuff heated up at UNC Chapel Hill's campus, and the buildings
right.
named after slaveholders, in 2015, my eyes like slowly began to open to realize that
Mm,
I had always accepted this kind of lionizing of the Confederacy. It's not like my history, but it is my history in the sense that I accepted it. I accepted it
Mm.
as important to somebody. I was
Right.
like, oh, that's some white people shit. Well, that's fine. But like, I wasn't questioning it. I wasn't questioning the
Mm.
value of it, for my own education or for anyone else's, much less, my black neighbors and friends,
Mm.
right? And classmates. So when I began to see what black activists were doing at UNC, it was like, oh, I had to realize that what I was being fed was poison, you know,
Mhm.
and I had to learn to reject it as a way of becoming a fuller human being,
Right.
and being able to and also just to like embrace the fact that I myself have been raised with um, anti black racist attitudes
Mhm.
and been implicitly supportive, for example, in the case of iconography, of uh, public art that was
Mhm.
anti-black, you know? And so when you start to sort of see things like that, you can't unsee them.
Mm.
And that's what I hope about like my students or, just young people in general, that they will begin to see a little bit earlier than I did, you know,
Right.
and then not unsee so they can like make the change that we have to make.
Right, I think unseeing is the hardest part
Mhm.
because there's some days you definitely wanna
Just
unsee
want to
things.
unsee it.
It just gets really traumatic and overwhelming at times, but I think it's that continued legacy of the struggle and pushing against these oppressive systems that are causing the stress to begin with, and that is in our DNA,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so we talk about this age-old form of resistance, whether it's the John Creek Indians or Lowery Gang, folks who were pushing back against the entrenchment of settler colonialism and white supremacy within our school system. We also get the more contemporary forms of our resistance against these systems, such as driving out of the KKK from Robeson County. We have figures and I would say cultural icons like Julian Pierce, who were really movement shakers for a lot of folks, and now in a more contemporary setting, uh, fighting back against environmental justice issues.
Yeah. Yeah. So the KKK thing, so, that's an interesting example. Because it was an example of a very diverse community, meaning a very diverse Lumbee and Tuscarora community. Our Tuscarora
Mm,
brothers and sisters in Robeson County are also forming a political identity at this time in the 1950s,
mhm,
starting in the 1930s, maybe before that. But it's kind of coming to its fruition in the 1950s as well. And so when you get into the mid 20th century in Lumbee history, you got to start talking about Lumbees and Tuscaroras because these are members of the same family groups, right?
mhm,
But people adopt different political identities in part because they envision different futures for themselves. So I try to explain it to other natives, like you've got Cherokee Nation, and then you've not got United Band of Katua,
mhm,
Cherokees. There's these folks are connected kinship wise, but they have different political identities because Indians are members of nations, right? So
mhm,
so Lumbees and Tuscarora people are coming together to wipe out or banish the Ku Klux Klan from our county because we saw what they represented as, you know, not just a harmful form of white supremacy that was affecting us, but as a a value system that we did not want to see in our future, and like as in America's future. you know that value system that the Klan represented in the 1950s really did not need to become, like it had in the 1880s, the ruling,
mhm,
controlling ideology of North Carolina's political future, you know? So in 1958, the short story is that about 500 Indians ambushed a Klan rally and shut it down and violently, and the Klan has never since held a public rally in Robeson County ever again. And that act was, some of like these they were not necessarily doing Lumbees were not Lumbees and Tuscaroras were not necessarily doing that because they were supportive of their black kin and neighbors. Going back to the conversation we were having before about anti-black racism, they were definitely some of them were supportive of their black kin and neighbors. Some of them were doing it because they simply did not want these outsiders, these Klan members, anywhere on our territory, especially with an ideology like the Klan promoted that forever basically proposed that our territory would be infringed upon. The Klan was just an arm of the Democratic Party at that point in many respects, in saying that like they were like kind of the militant wing of the conservative Democrat Party in certain parts of North Carolina and the South. So this militant wing of the Democratic Party was really interested in a kind of complete political control and being able to firmly establish Democrats as the party of white supremacy that would be the only Democratic option, the only option for North Carolina forevermore. So Lumbees did not want somebody coming into our territory saying this is how you're going to be governed, you know, and that was partly the spirit of driving out the Ku Klux Klan. It was not so much a rejection of the Ku Klux Klan's anti-black racism, though in some ways it was, or for some of the participants that night, I think it was.
Mm.
But then when you fast forward to the 1970s and 1980s, and a man like Julian Pierce, he was an attorney, a Lumbee attorney who was from the Hoke County community. He'd actually been raised in a place called Hawkeye in Hoke County. He was a UNC Pembroke graduate. Went to Georgetown to get a law degree, I believe, or did he get his chemistry degree at Georgetown? Anyway, he did. He worked in the Washington D.C. area. He came back. He also got his law degree and came back to Robeson County to run our legal aid unit, our nonprofit legal advice unit in Robeson County, which was mainly serving Indian and Black clients around civil matters, not criminal matters. But he also took over Lumbee River Legal Services at a time when the drug trade was at its height. And so, just like alcohol, the trade in liquor had been criminalized heavily in the 19th century. The entire United States government apparatus was busy criminalizing the trade in narcotics for black and brown communities through, nationwide, right? And as much as they could beyond national borders. And this was, in the end, so that whites could continue to profit off of the labor of black and brown people. But while, much of what we know about American Indian history at this time is the establishment of the American Indian movement, which Tuscaroras in particular were heavily participating in, the Lumbee judge who first sentenced the Ku Klux Klan leader in the aftermath of this rally in 1958 was one of the early organizers of one of the early participants in some of the National Congress of American Indian meetings that led to the National Indian Youth Conference organizing and kind of resulted in like a lot of what we now know as the Red Power movement resistance against termination policy. So
Right.
anyway, so you had Lumbees involved in some ways in the Red Power movement, and then you also had Tuscaroras that were heavily involved in like the BIA takeover in 1972. Just guessing on the date there.
Yeah, and there's some of the occupation in
Yeah, the
Washington as well,
occupation in
right?
Washington. There were Lumbees at Alcatraz. There were Lumbees at Wounded Knee. So you kind of and Tuscaroras. So you just kind of go through this like we're always participating, and then we've always got our own thing going on at home. So
Mm.
while the American Indian movement was getting, a lot of national visibility at home, our folks are moving into the narcotics trade because guess what? The economy's drying up, right? Jobs are disappearing. Tobacco farming is becoming unsustainable. Um, Factory jobs are just moving into Robeson County, but again, they're highly segregated, so it becomes difficult. Not becomes, it was still difficult for Indians to get a factory job for a long time, or you had to move out of the
Yeah.
community to get one, right? So
Mhm.
there's all of this job loss and turmoil. You got the energy crisis. You got all these reasons for people to turn to narcotics as a form of property to 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 make a living, and also to become wealthy. Um, that's what every American wants. They want to get paid for what they know, and so why shouldn't they? If you know how to trade narcotics, that becomes a form of property that the Nixon administration begins to heavily, heavily criminalize. So when Julian Pierce becomes the director of legal services, um, a lot of Lumbees are increasingly trapped in this local court system, which is not only criminalizing them because that's kind of like the public policy, but also because the courts have always been a kind of the oil to kind of a white supremacist engine in Robeson County.
Mm.
The things that we're
Yeah, that's
familiar,
right.
right, that we're familiar with today, like um, you know, serving in jail and serving time in jail because you can't pay bond, and things that affect poor people everywhere were intensifying there because there was a way for a very small group of elite, meaning politically powerful whites, to run the economic systems of the county by continually tying people up in court, and forcing them to pay or to serve jail time because they could not pay bond because bonds were set unreasonably high, you know, or basically there was a court calendaring system. Like, this is really mundane, but Julian Pierce gets involved because there's a court calendaring system that means that defendants never know when their trial is going to be. And
Mm.
defendants and their attorney, there's no public defender in the county, for example. So defendants and their attorneys never know when their name is going to be called for trial or for a hearing. And so people just show up at court every morning and wait all day. And guess what? You're going to lose your job, you know,
Jeez.
and somebody else is going to take that job who hasn't gotten trapped in this so called criminal justice system. So Julian Pierce gets involved in what the county courts are doing around the criminalization of the drug trade because his clients are caught up in an unfair system that also profits off of drugs. And so the sheriff's office at this time in Robeson County, white run, largely unintegrated, not completely unintegrated, but largely unintegrated narcotics unit in the sheriff's office is participating in the trade. They are also profiting from it because they look at Indian and black drug dealers and say, you can make $25,000 in one night. A sheriff's deputy is making $25,000 in a whole year in 1984, you know. And so, again, every American wants to make money for what they know. And they want to get on that because there is no reason in a county that's founded upon white supremacy that Indians are making more money than white people, right? People are looking at that and
Right.
they're like, that's not fair. Like, blink, blink. Well, um, the sheriff's department gets involved in this work in order to make money. I mean, for the same reasons that everybody else is involved in it. So that, of course, means that the justice system is bent towards the advantage of people working in the sheriff's department or allied with those folks, not to the advantage of Indians and blacks not who are doing the same economic activity but not working in the sheriff's department. Um, so in the end, Julian becomes a kind of key figure in investigating this activity on the behalf of the sheriff's department's part. He's not working for the sheriff's department, but he's investigating their activities because people just trust him. He's native, like he's wrapped into our kinship system. He was somebody who kept his word. He was involved in a lot of different things. He was working on federal recognition, for example. He was the first person to
Mm-hmm.
set up an Indian law unit um, in North Carolina that was at that time was really assembling the petition that we then sent to the BIA for the federal acknowledgement process. So he was doing a ton of different things, was very knowledgeable, and he was well regarded and trusted. And when he decided to run for judge was when I think the heat on him got really intense because the person he was running against was the same prosecutor that created the calendaring system, which I mentioned earlier, that
Mm-hmm.
kept, the courts flowing to the advantage not of defendants but of the county government. He was the same prosecutor that had held the Guinness World Record for deadliest DA, sending more people to death row than any other prosecutor in U.S. history. His name was Joe Freeman Britt. And so Britt was running for judge, which most Indians were like, oh my God, no. Can we not have this, please? And so
So not
not
again.
again. And so Julian steps forward and says, well, I'm going to run for judge. And, you know, there was really about, I think, a 4 or 5 month time frame in which Robeson County was, people use that word kind of powder keg. I mean, I think it was more than that in a way, but
Mm.
there was just the political violence there was extremely high, and combined with the volatility of the drug trade, the violence that was a cost of doing business in that trade, the number of unsolved murders in the sheriff's department, um, as well as the number of people killed in police custody or killed by sheriff's deputies at that time, Indian people or black people killed by sheriff's deputies or in police custody. Those um, those events meant that the months in which Julian was running for judge against Joe Freeman Britt were, I think, among the most intense of any period of our history, possibly of American history. But any period, certainly in Lumbee history, that kind of 6 month window, you know, what we are today as a community is largely because of what happened during that 6 months. And so this is all in the book if somebody wanted to go like get all the detail. But what winds up happening is that Julian Pierce, who is running against Joe Freeman Britt, is assassinated 6 weeks before the election. And who he was killed by and how he was killed, is the subject of like much narrative um, imagination. The evidence that we have is very sparse. The evidence that's publicly available, anyway, is very sparse, and suffice to say that the elements of his murder really added up to a not a break-in, not an attack by unknown assailants, but an attack by people who knew him, who had been had been following him, had been working with him up to that point, right? So
Mhm.
there's enough of a kind of conspiracy sort of element about the obvious circumstances surrounding the murder to make you at least ask the question, couldn't this have something to do with the other, you know, well organized drug conspiracy that is, unfolding at the exact same
Yeah.
time? It's you look at these things together and you're like, okay, probably, but nobody really can talk about that. It's not, we're
Yeah.
still not safe in being able to talk about many of the things that
Yeah,
people
not
know.
publicly.
Yeah, and so having grown up there, what year were you born?
1998.
Yeah, so this happened 10 years before you were born.
Mhm.
But I think you imagine, and growing up there, like people don't want to talk about this 6 month period much. You know, it's still like a dangerous thing in
Yeah,
some
it sounds
ways.
dramatic too.
Yeah, and people were hurt, and people are still living who were hurt. It's not like it's
Mm,
over. It's still kind of going on. So, um, as a recent episode of a very traumatic history, you wouldn't be surprised that people are still dealing with this. But it is like, 30 plus years ago. So
right.
we would hope that we could at least begin to learn some of the things that happened so as to prevent them from happening again. But what we're dealing with now, I think, is the same kind of economy that was really kind of put into motion during the Reagan administration.
Mm,
We're still dealing with the same patterns of criminalization that were put into motion during the Nixon administration, and we're also dealing with the same set of Indian policies that were put into motion during that time frame. Right, federal
mm,
recognition on the one hand, and the kind of positives and negatives of that, but then also the sort of twisted ways in which the Supreme Court can wrestle self determination out of our hands as Indian people, is happening every single term of court. You're like, what is it now? And McGirt was a wonderful, uh, fascinating decision, but it had to be Ginsburg's like act of guilt after she did what she did in some of the earlier cases, like the United cases and stuff like that, right?
mm.
Like, you just have to say, like, what are
White
y'all
guilt set
doing?
in.
Yeah,
Right.
what you've recognized. Ginsburg recognized that her karma was going to come back to bite her, I guess. But like, they're just, they're continuing to make up law to undermine our self determination. And
Mm,
so that's what's happening, like right now in 2020 in Robeson County, is that we're seeing on a macro level these things that have happened to Native people everywhere in the United States are happening to us. And we're also seeing how things that happened where we are, like in the 1980s with Julian Pierce, are still happening to us.
mm.
And we're also just trying to like creatively figure out how do we keep going, and try
Right.
to change it for our descendants.
Absolutely. And to touch on it really briefly, I know that with some of the movement elders and my mentors in different aspects, Miss Donna Chavis, as well as Mac Ledgerson.
Mhm.
Mac in particular, I know was real close friends with Julian Pierce, and I know just within adjacent conversation of that entire topic, it's complete mood shift
Oh yeah.
and the amount of loss uh, that I feel is it's still to this day a continued grieving over this incident, and there's just a hush hush nature about everything and a continued fear for what might come after if more information was leaked or there's just an uncertainty,
Yeah, there's so
right?
much, fear, right?
Mm,
Fear. I thought about calling it the reign of terror in my
mm.
book, and I was like, nah, that's too European. Let me come up with something else. But
Right.
when I was studying the French Revolution in high school, it was right around that same time that Julian was killed. I remember this time period.
Mm,
I was about, I don't know, 16 or something at the time, 15 or 16. And so, I remember thinking, like, this must be what these folks in France felt like, you know, living with this type of politically exerted fear,
mm.
and the uncertainty around that. Um, and yeah, it's really hard to talk about. It's hard to understand. And when I was writing it in the book too, I began to think of it as kind of my like Dementor chapter. When
Right.
it's a puzzling history to sort through based on the available source material, but it's also it's just really it's anyway it's very emotional, I think. And yeah, knowing people who lived through it, who were
Mm,
participants in it, who've suffered because of it, it's had a profound impact on us.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it between then and now, a lot of the movements we are seeing are coming from the younger generations, and I think it's that I think right now we're kind of in that transitionary phase of needing to pass the torch off. And luckily, and so thankfully, we're seeing a lot of younger Lumbee leadership start to take hold with a lot of things like environmental justice. Um, More recently, with cases like the proposed Atlantic Coast Pipeline, as well as continued issues that are plaguing the community, such as the proposed liquid natural gas facility site in Wakulla.
Right. Julian lived in Wakulla,
Mm.
that was where he had his house and where he was killed. Um, yeah, I mean, so I'm not as familiar as you are with the particular solutions that we can do around natural gas transport and extraction.
Hmm.
But it does appear to me to be a repeat of some really familiar patterns. I mean,
Right.
maybe you can tell me like what's the difference, or what's the things that like we need to be watching around this issue right now?
Right. So I think it goes back to an earlier notion that I touched on about the entities at play within the outcomes of our community. Because I got involved with this when I first came into college. I was actually Miss Donna Chavis, who she was coincidentally on the tail end of one of the walks they did against the ACP, and there was the UNCP homecoming powwow, not the homecoming powwow, but rather the school's powwow.
Hmm.
And I was there doing some activism, raising awareness about the project because for me, my radicalizing moment was the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Hmm.
And I think that was also the radicalizing moment for a lot of my peers as well,
Yeah.
in getting more conscious on the greater issues at stake in Indian country. And now, bam, not even a few months later, this same type of project, though in a different material, is now in my backyard.
Hmm.
And so it was with that involvement that I had the opportunity. It was actually where I first met you
Right.
as well because I was an intern with Appalachian Voices and Nika Robinson, um, and I was helping with the school trip for your Lumbee class
Yeah.
during the summer
Mhm.
with Dr. Ryan Emanuel, who's also a great Lumbee scholar. He does a lot of hydrology work and water resources, as well as Mac. And it was actually that moment that I think I had like you referenced earlier with the Silent Sam situation on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill. I think my beginning stages of eye opening was when I was on the river
Right.
and I experienced something another colleague had referred to as genetic memory,
Hmm.
and it's going through the same motions in a pattern um, that your ancestors did. It kind of evokes almost indescribable feeling. And it was then when I was on the river and helping take the students down with Mac, yourself, and Dr. Ryan Emanuel that it just came full circle to me.
Yeah.
You know, I was one who came up in the community. I grew up impoverished. I faced homelessness. A lot of other personal issues that have gone on in my life have been traumatic, right? And it led me to want to leave Robeson County.
Hmm.
Like my other schools where I got accepted to were Hofstra in New
Hmm.
York and the University of Seattle. So complete
You were
opposite sides of
you're
the
getting the
country,
hell
right?
out.
Right.
Hmm.
So with that, unfortunately, before that time came, the fall of my senior year, my father was incarcerated. He was my primary financial, I would say, resource at the time. So those options were pretty much out of the way because out of state was way too expensive, and I stayed at UNCP. But I'm so glad that I did because it was through that internship and that work, that physical engagement with the work, and as well as with elders and oral traditions of what's happened over the years and generations, how things have changed, that I was able uh, to recognize that it's not our fault.
Hmm.
It's not
Right.
a result of the people who are in this situation. Their their suffering is a byproduct of something else, some greater insidious force that's at play, right? And I think this was after one of our reading groups with TRN. I think that was my first grappling with the concept of settler colonialism, but I didn't know it was settler colonialism
Right.
at the time.
Right.
And so I was basically that was my moment of realizing it. And what it came to form with was not just with government entities. It's not just with these powerful elites, most oftentimes uh, white wealthy elites, but also some of our own kin and from other demographics, but from corporate entities as well that are predatory and finding ways to infiltrate our communities under the same guise, the same principles, pretty much BS. I'm going to promise you these resources if you give me what you have on your lands,
Yeah,
if you give me
everything you
access to your
have.
land.
Right.
That continual extraction, that ceding of territories without any proper consultation, without any actual discussion or input from the community for that matter about this issue. And it is a continual thing, like for the past 2 months, even. And this isn't even ACP related. It's not North Carolina related. Just fossil fuel industry related. Um, I keep seeing this advertisement on YouTube pop up that starts off with such a cheery note. There's like a lot of environmental themes going on. Chicks running through the woods with her Nike free runs, and it's talking about going towards the clean energy that we need for the future to fight climate
Whew.
crisis. And then it's find out what natural gas and oil companies are doing. And I'm just like, oh my God,
Oh,
where's the skip
hypocrisy.
ad button?
Right.
So it's like there's also this other insidious element that's being added to the mixture of what we're facing here, and the way that they're coming into our communities. And it's not just fossil fuels, and it's not just oil giants. It's a lot of different corporations, and it's abusive relationship, the same way that tobacco companies had with our communities in years prior. Um, and the health impact, the financial impact that it has on folks. So I think that's also one of the transforming elements of this movement is as we're pulling folks into it and making this transition of passing the torch off to newer generations, it's also a new beast. Rather, it's the same beast. It just has another head added onto it. So kind of like a Hydra,
Yeah.
or like it's a Cerberus type.
You
Cerberus is probably the best, yeah, because wealthy elite, government, and corporate entities all coming together
know. Mhm.
to wreak havoc.
Well, you know what that is so like, Jordan, the metaphor you just mentioned, we have the black snake that was the
Mm,
pipeline, right? Dakota Access Pipeline.
right.
We also have the great horned serpent in our ancestors' traditions.
Mm.
And the great horned serpent, of course, was the force of the underworld that would create chaos. Not necessarily
Oh.
like hell in the same sense of like the
Hmm.
Christian like bad.
Right.
um like all bad things, but it's just more like a lot of chaos in comparison to the order that is the above world. Um and the sense of harmony that we're trying to create on this world, right? And so yeah, you've just sort of identified how like colonialism is giving more power to this great horned serpent than than it's supposed to have.
Mm.
You know, it
Yeah,
is.
absolutely.
Yeah, it's like another. So anyway, how do we stop it? Or if we can't
Right.
stop it, like in this generation, like what do you think we need to do to get from here to a place where we can live in that sense of order and balance?
Right. And I think it goes into a lot of the movement work that's being done with things like our fight for federal recognition with benefits and a way we interact with land and develop our political and cultural identities as a tribal nation, right? Because thank goodness we were able to stop the proposed ACP, which is one of the largest infrastructure projects initiated in U.S. history.
Right.
Was one of the only infrastructure projects related to natural gas that was on Trump's first 50 days to do
I
list,
know.
or priority
Failed.
list rather.
He failed.
That was, yeah, thank goodness. But we were able to show, and it was actually in the testament to why this project was basically all the funds were pulled out, was a result of grassroots activists on the ground. And that's not just here in North Carolina, but also throughout the pipelines route in Virginia and West Virginia as well. But it's through that continued engagement of the community, even though support for environmental issues I feel aren't as prominent, unfortunately, with because there's just honestly so much shit that's going down in the community,
Right.
and folks are having to work and provide for families, so it's hard. And the system's intentionally set up this way to make it hard for us to organize against it. But luckily, we were able to stop this project through continual delay, community engagement, engagement with our scholars and folks from different fields to actually put a stop to this giant $1 billion project that was going to come through our lands. So I think we've learned a lot in terms of what resources we can use and what avenues are valid. Because for me, I always thought coming in from my perspective of not being very well politically educated beyond Democrats and Republicans from high school to college, started learning the different avenues. I thought I wanted to go into the system to fix it. I quickly realized that was probably not the route I wanted to take, or else I would be depressed for the rest of my life.
Right.
so so finding those different avenues of engagement with the community and sustaining that education, awareness, but also helping folks redefine their connection with the land and what it means to them. Because I think one thing that stood out to me with some of the work we're doing with the liquid natural gas facility is that these landowners are being told that there's no choice. Once again, the same narrative
Hmm.
that it's going to happen. Folks everywhere else in the community have already signed on to this, which is a lie. Um, and folks are just kind of like, whatever,
Yeah.
because there's always been this sense of there's nothing I can do about this. So I think what's really beautiful and inspiring during this time and the work we've been able to accomplish and hope to continue to accomplish is we're really redefining the agency folks have with not only their land and energy, but with their outlook on their livelihood,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So helping redefine and reshape that into a narrative that's going to be more empowering and self-sustaining, and giving these folks the opportunity to fight back against these issues, become more educated, become more empowered, and create those resources as a community to push back against these forces that are coming in our community or already exist in our community in insidious ways.
Yeah. So, continuing to organize,
Yep.
continue
I think a lot
to
of
kind of flip the
organizing,
narrative. Am I hearing that right?
right. Yeah, a lot of that. Also, political education on what I refer to as expanding political ideation.
Mm.
What is possible
Hmm.
politically?
Hmm.
Do we always have to go through electoral politics to make changes? That's definitely an avenue that folks have taken and folks gravitate towards that. But are there any systems that we could be creating, our own communal forms of power beyond things such as tribal council, the tribal chairman, county commissioners? Are there folks, allies we can align ourselves with who are going to be coming in with mindsets that are for the people and making sure they're not there to line their pocket,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So, what does that look like to be doing more intentional community organizing instead of just accepting whoever's on the ballot, if they're even contested, that is, in some
Right.
cases?
And holding them accountable when they get there.
Right,
Um,
right. So,
yeah.
what would it look like for us to do like for the recent protests of the elder housing situation?
Hmm.
God knows what's happening with the housing funds for the tribe, but that really struck that nerve of resistance against not just oppression but inequality and things that aren't right.
Right.
Folks really organizing, even if it wasn't on like a grand scale, it showed that there is a need in the community,
Mhm.
and with that need comes the opportunity for unity of folks who are from all types of backgrounds, political identities, um, racial identities, to come together and push back against these issues as a community. I think that's part of the process that needs to happen for us to not only start to reconcile with some of the past, but to also preserve some of that tradition for the future,
Right.
because we need to be cultivating more of those movement leaders, more folks who are politically educated, and have accessibility to the movement.
So yeah, so I'm thinking about um I'm thinking about kind of creating a message and an action that
Mm,
helps people see their interests, their personal self-interest aligned with that which will, as you said, maintain tradition,
mm,
uh, help things go forward, and that people will maybe see their personal self-interest aligned, well, of course, aligned with others, right? Uh,
right.
um, but at least in the shorter term, there's a way in which I'm just so intrigued by what you said about like um, helping people understand that their land ownership interests are not can't and shouldn't be reduced to this or that. That it's not a
Mm,
zero sum game,
right.
and that nor should their tribal government be a zero sum game. People don't have
Hmm.
to engage with one way of doing things. They have to build or know that they can rebuild ways of accountability and governance that actually serves themselves. So getting people to get involved based on seeing their self-interest and aligned with you know, what will um, yes, I'm just not phrasing it as well as you did, but what will produce like more than zero sum game thinking. Like
Right.
not the binary, but let's get together and think of something other than the binary, like other than
Right.
the this or that
Non,
option.
none of the binary thinking, none of the pie game. What's something that can be intentionally developed as a cross collaboration project of unification,
Mhm.
to pull folks together for making progress.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I mean, what you did with Atlantic Coast Pipeline and a lot of others, I was mostly observing it from a distance, but being able to see people talk who were not previously talking,
Mm.
you know,
Right.
just talk out loud, but also talk to each other, maybe,
Mm.
and uh, and I could call somebody and say, "Who do I need to talk?" So and so called me about this issue about the ACP. Like, who can I talk to? I would get a cool, different answer every single time because that to me that felt like
Mm.
more people getting involved who were more knowledgeable about the movement. You know,
Right.
and so I think that's already a good example of um, what standard normalized party politics might call a consensus issue, but it's
Mm.
just a human right or something.
Yeah.
To where a human right to clean water, to
Mm.
staying in place, to um a non-contaminated sacred space. Our right to that can be something that many people get behind. I feel like I saw certainly the beginnings of that with
Mm.
the anti-pipeline work. And again, it was just for me, it was anecdotally just kind of touching base with the issue every so often, and realizing I could hear from somebody different,
Yeah,
that there were more
absolutely.
people engaged
Hmm.
than the folks who were always engaged.
Right. It's that constant need for a gradual narrative shift. But I think what we really need to do because it took us well over 4 years to stop this
Yeah.
project, right? And now we, right before, literally, I want to say 5 months before it was halted and canceled, another fossil fuel infrastructure project pops up,
Mm.
and we're still facing issues from things like industrial agriculture. So I think we need to add more fire to this movement, and we need more flexibility,
Mm.
right? Because what we need to accomplish between now and the next 10 years, we can't wait 4 years to stop this project. We need to be able to stop it more aggressively and also more intentionally as a greater movement in the Southeast
And
for
having
connecting
all of
people.
the levers at our disposal. So that's why federal recognition
Right,
would help so much, right?
right.
I get
And that gets into it.
Yeah, I get personally, or sort of as a scholar, ambivalent about federal recognition because I have know enough of the history to know the kinds of compromises entailed in that. They're
Hmm.
really deep, but at the same time, having standing to sue, for example, as a tribal community, would maybe mean that at least that piece of the puzzle could be addressed a lot more quickly.
Right.
Obviously, having the consultation voice at the table, but the federal regulators don't care as much about that. It doesn't
Yeah,
seem,
unfortunately.
but they will care about a lawsuit. Um, and having the standing to sue is not something we currently have, and
Right.
that's not one of the levers that we can use right now.
Hmm.
So yeah, oh, I really appreciate this education from you. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And same to you as well.
yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for everything
I think, thank you. Yeah, I'm flattered.
you're doing. Well,
And I think it also gets into a conversation, and we can get into now or at another time about the current fight for recognition, some of the land ownership issues that come with it.
yeah. Well, I think we might have to get into the full flower of it at another time.
Yeah.
But it does strike me that the there's a narrative shift, right, that has to take place with Lumbee
Mm,
federal recognition. And I think it's a narrative shift that can make a positive difference for tribes everywhere, perhaps.
hmm.
So especially as Native people throughout are trying to think wherever they're living, whether it's on trust land or not, um, wherever they're living, they're trying to think about how to wield political and economic power to the benefit of their communities. What Lumbee federal recognition does is that because trust land is not the only option, right, to come out of Lumbee federal
Hmm.
recognition, because we can take housing, education, healthcare, and other reparation funds. That's what it is to me, is that it's a reparation. Because we can take reparation funds and apply them not just to our own citizens, but to, you know, in some cases, just the community at large, in the way that a hospital facility, for example, can serve natives and non natives. Um, Being able to provide that economic development benefit for the state of North Carolina and, of course, the state of South Carolina and like everywhere else
Hmm.
is really a chance to then use the trust land relationship, hopefully more to our benefit than to our detriment. So, in American history, it's trust land has also meant plenary power. It's also meant that Congress has the right to literally do basically whatever it wants to with your land.
Right.
And because I
Good old federal
the whole
paternalism.
federal paternalism thing, and in the case of Lumbee recognition, because we own our own land, we're using our capital in all these different ways for the benefit of our community and non-native communities, as all together.
Mm.
Trust land becomes something that is kind of like not the tail wagging the dog, it's actually the tail. of the dog. And it's like it
Mhm.
stays like if our private land ownership situation is the kind of dog, then the trust land is the tail. Like it's important, right? It's a
Mhm.
lever. It keeps the dog in balance. Um, it does certain things with the dog, but it's not like the mind of the dog. It's not
Mhm.
controlling the economic future of the community the way that it has, unfortunately, in a lot of other Native communities because their history is
Right.
different, right? Um, and one of the things that our Lumbee leadership used in the 1950s when we got this partial recognition, they were kind of agreeing with Congress's termination policy to say, like, we don't want a reservation, you know, we don't want to be
Mhm.
like like they thought of Indians as people who were dependent on the government. I mean, they just didn't know very much, but you know, they were subject to the same stereotypes, unfortunately, about other Native people as white Americans
Mhm.
were. But, they were making these arguments like, "We don't want the full package because we don't want a reservation." And Congress was like, "Okay." Check. Like, no need to give these people full federal recognition, like, they don't even want it, right? Well, that, of course, was a trick, but what we're able to see now in 2020 is that we can enter into a trust relationship with the Department of the Interior for a parcel of land that will enable us to exercise our right to self-determination,
Mhm.
in a way that will continue to support the economic development efforts that we are already engaged in, not just as a tribal government, but as like individual tribal citizens, you know? And because us as individual tribal citizens own our own land, many of us, not everybody, um, that means that we have a kind of wealth to access that will, I think, or I hope, keep that trust relationship kind of in check, you know,
Mhm.
or put a sort of check and a balance on it, to use the wrong government metaphor. Um, but yeah, to kind of put a check and a balance on it, rather than letting it control everything else about our economic fortunes as a people. And I hope that if we
Mhm.
can actually fulfill that model of federal recognition, that can become more the norm for a lot of other sovereign American Indian communities,
Hmm.
in the United States. I don't know. I don't know if other people want that, but I just know that, like, that would be something that, at least could provide us a kind of new way to govern, I hope,
Right.
over our land. If we think of it as part of it is trust land and part of it is not trust land, and that the opportunities embedded in both types of land are fulfilled in our community, we could be doing something new. At least it's not going to be without compromises, but I hope it would at least be new. So that's what I hope for when I think about Lumbee federal recognition. I
Mhm.
care about the housing, the healthcare, the education, the ability, to have a meaningful material impact on energy development. Um,
Mhm.
but I also think about, like, this: what can we do with capital that's really different than what capitalists have done.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's the future conversation that needs to be had, not just not just within the community, but also with tribal leaders who are pushing for this recognition effort,
Yeah.
right? So if we get to that point, if we receive the benefits, what does that consultation process look like for input from the community to help define the future of Lumbee sovereignty and Lumbee recognition?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty epic. Think about it.
Right.
I mean, it could
Absolutely.
change everything, and it's about
Yeah,
damn
that would be the biggest game changer.
time. So I can't believe we've gone on so long. I'm sorry.
Right. No, you're perfectly fine. This is the typical Lumbee experience,
Right?
folks. This is it.
This is it.
It is time well spent. And
Rob,
I think
yeah,
this would be a good opportunity for us to wrap up. And I truly do appreciate your time and all that you've done for our people.
I
Uh,
appreciate what you've done for
as
our people, Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those of you who are interested, again, in the book I was referenced throughout this podcast, is Lumbee Indians, An American Struggle. The link to the book itself will be put into the podcast bio, and that'll be linked to the Amazon page for the book. Again, I appreciate you, Dr. Lowery, and thank you for everything that you've done.
Appreciate you.
And
Appreciate y'all, all y'all.